I'm deeply honored now to introduce this afternoon's featured speaker, Shamila Chaudhary, co-chair of the Afghanistan War Commission and former White House Director for Pakistan and Afghanistan on the National Security Council. Shamila Chaudhary is an international affairs analyst specializing in U.S. foreign policy with a focus on South Asia. She served as president of the American-Pakistan Foundation, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, South Asia Center, and a senior fellow at New America. In her personal capacity, she is a member of the Foreign Policy for America Leadership Circle and serves on the Advisory Council of South Asians for America. Ms. Chaudhary worked for over a decade in the U.S. government, including her role in the White House as Director for Pakistan and Afghanistan on national security from 2010 to 2011. Please join me in welcoming Shamila Chaudhary to the podium.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Dr. Farhadi. And I'd like to thank the Institute and the university for hosting today's conference, and in particular, General McKenzie for his leadership and modeling of what public service should look like before and after government, and for the hospitality of this Tampa community. Let me go off script for just a moment. It's incredible to see so many people in the room after such a long day of talks about difficult issues, conversations that we've been having with ourselves and with each other for so long. And I find it to be extremely comforting that so many of you took the time out of your schedule to stay with us throughout the day. In particular, as myself and my fellow colleagues on the commission flew down from Washington to listen and learn from all of you. And that's really why we're here today, to listen and learn. We've been on some of the panels, but for us, this is an opportunity to take a step back at a moment in time where we're afforded the space and time to think about this war in a way that we didn't have when the war was happening. And I see that as a real opportunity. And I'd like you to know that the Commission intends to do that with the utmost empathy and compassion as much as possible while we ask the hard questions. So you have our public commitment to that, but I ask you to join us in that process so it doesn't end today, it starts today. It's wonderful to see so many students here. You are one of our primary audiences for what my co-chair, Dr. Colin Jackson, earlier discussed is a report that we hope comes out in 2026. We officially began the work of the commission in August of 2023, and we have benefited already from so much of the wisdom and expertise that's in this room. And the goal of this project and gathering all of your wisdom and expertise is to learn from the past and not repeat the mistakes made and opportunities missed in Afghanistan. And when I tell friends and colleagues that this is the purpose of our project, I get a lot of side eye, I get a lot of skepticism. People kind of laugh uncomfortably, and then they ask, why on earth would you take this project on? It's completely difficult. It's impossible. And I think all of that is fair and warranted. The US government, as we know, is not known for its efficiency or effectiveness, and even less so for our ability to course correct and learn. In fact, we've overcorrected in some cases in the wrong ways. And earlier we heard from Ambassador McKinley of some of the examples of our interventions and engagements in peace processes that went well. And I think that's important to highlight as we go through this very difficult process of having some political and social courage to acknowledge what didn't go well, is to remember that we can do this. So that historical perspective is really important, and our project is infused with that throughout. So for this reason, I think, and it's great that I'm talking at the end of the day, because what I'm going to share with you will allude to the previous conversations that we've had. I think now, the commission is 1.5 years into its mandate, and we've spent a lot of our public time talking about our philosophical approach, our commitment to bipartisan engagement, our commitment to nonpartisan outputs, but we haven't really had the chance yet to talk about how we will identify and distill the lessons from the war. And we are at a really good place in terms of the Commission's focus on the chronology of the war, on our understanding of the stakeholders involved and the big questions that need to be addressed, so that we can actually start that conversation with you today. So it's a very special moment for us. We haven't had this conversation in a public format. One of the questions I get asked a lot, and my colleagues get asked a lot when we talk about our work, is, what are you going to discover that's not new anymore? So much has been written about Afghanistan, about the U.S. engagement. And it's true, a lot of good work has been done across the board. So not just pre- and post-service kind of analysis from government and policy practitioners, but some really good research and scholarship has been done. Allied governments have looked at themselves and their role in Afghanistan as well. And we all know the work of the various inspectors general that ask the big questions about US involvement in Afghanistan. So countless lessons, if you will, have been identified already. And they take the form of different narratives about what went wrong and why. And we heard many of them today. And if you'll bear with me, I'll go through some of them, because while the Commission doesn't endorse these views, or we're not putting them forward as fact, they are narratives that we will contend with in our work, and they're all going to sound very familiar to you. But our goal is to take the familiar and turn it upside down on its head and ask questions in an objective way, in a candid way, with honesty, but in a space that allows for some freedom of thought on the part of practitioners and those who served. And what's interesting when we think through these narratives, which I'll go through, it's clear that some of them privilege one lens over the other. And you all know this already. I'm not telling you anything new, but the war was complex in many ways. But for our part as a US government, the complexity was also connected to the fact that we took many lenses. We had so many different lenses that we were using to approach the war. It wasn't just CT. We added the developmental aspect, the developmental lens, the public diplomacy lens, et cetera. And I think that's what complicates our analysis. So for example, we hear this a lot. The United States never had a clear strategy or clear goals in Afghanistan. There was a mismatch of ends, ways, and means. The Iraq War distracted the Americans from Afghanistan. I say this all the time, but actually when I sat down to think about what I really meant, there was no meat to my argument. So we're pushing ourselves on the Commission to actually ask ourselves, how did it distract? Did it distract in terms of the ability of certain resources? Did it attract in terms of the political capital that policymakers in Washington had to deal with other issues? So it's a very interesting project, because it really challenges us to be honest about what we say and dissect it. The US had no war termination strategy beyond complete military victory. Or that, we've said this today multiple times, the United States didn't understand the history or the culture or politics of Afghanistan, even though there was so much money that was poured in to create a knowledge economy about the country. We consulted many of you in this room over the course of 20 years. So the knowledge wasn't there, but the intent was there, or is there something else we should be asking? So these are all very powerful questions. I think now that we have some space from the withdrawal, which was very painful, we are able to ask these questions in a way that infuses some objectivity. Those of you who are living the post-withdrawal dynamic day to day are not so lucky, and we hope that our line of questioning will respect kind of the changes that are happening in the day-to-day. We're very mindful that we shouldn't turn this into just an intellectual exercise, because people have to live the impact of our intervention in Afghanistan. So these examples are also interesting to me because they attribute primary responsibility to the United States. They're very US-centric. But there are these other narratives that focus on dynamics that are largely out of US control. For example, the one that we talk often about is the Taliban sanctuary in Pakistan, or the ethnic, linguistic, and geographic cleavages in Afghan society that produce the divisive politics and weaken the republic, or that the military or security forces just gave up. The issue of corruption in the government and security forces, eroding institutions and alienating the Afghan people, or the Taliban's degree of support amongst the population. While all of these could be true in some respect, probably no one factor is determinative. And this way of looking at it, that they all could be true but not completely, is I think what we have to push ourselves to keep thinking about. Just from my own experience working in policy in the most urgent environment after the 9/11 attacks, and as the sense of fear kind of evolved, it's really hard to be deliberate and determinative in a way that's thoughtful and intentional and balanced. And again, we have this opportunity today and for the rest of the mandate of the commission, and I think that's a real privilege. So one of the tasks on the commission is to take these narratives and look at the explanations for the narratives and probe them and weigh them with the benefit of the unique access that we have as a commission. This is what makes our work different than everything else that has been written about before, which is we have access to documentary evidence and the senior-most decision makers within the US government. So we're in this position of power and access if we yield it correctly, if we manage the relationships with our government and the interlocutors well, we'll be able to ask the questions that have been the hardest for us to answer. But some of them are so obvious. So when I wrote these down and I read them and we're working through these with the teams, they seem so basic to me now after the fact. And I feel like a lot of us have gone through this, that did we make it more complicated than it had to be? Was it actually more straightforward and simple? And so that's another interesting byproduct of what a commission can do. It can simplify the biggest, most complex challenges for bureaucracies that are big and cannot move quickly. And so questions like, during the early period of the war, how did the United States define the enemy? And why did the United States do that? What was the motivation? Was it based on intelligence assessments? Was it based on advocacy groups talking to the US government? Was it based on fear? It could be any of those things and all of those things at the same time. And our job is to pursue that with a fact-based approach, acknowledging at the same time that there's a lot of emotion involved, there's a lot of politics involved. Another question that we get asked a lot, as you do from the public, is why did the United States include the Taliban in its targeting when Al-Qaeda was responsible for the 9/11 attacks? I get asked this question by my children. It makes no sense to them. And I always say, how much time do you have? Because it is a long story, right? If you worked it, you know it. If you know, you know. But I love that I'm having these conversations with kids in junior high, in high school, in elementary school. But you know why? Because they saw the withdrawal happen on TV. They have kids from Afghanistan in their classroom. They're Americans now, or they're becoming Americans. So the social fabric of our countries has changed by virtue of this war. That's actually something really special. And I think, Ambassador Jawad, you were talking about this earlier, and others have alluded to it, that we've created this unique ecosystem amongst ourselves that, again, is infused with pain and tragedy, blood, treasure loss, but also a lot of good intentions and some good things did happen too. So the questions we ask have to get at all of that, right? Another question that we will look at as a commission is, why did the US pursue a military and civilian surge while also at the same time announcing a timeline for withdrawal? I was in the White House when this happened. It was a surprising development to many of us who had worked on these issues, and it bears asking, why did we do that in the moment? Because there's, I think, an explanation of in the moment that will help us understand, at least as Americans, what our leaders were thinking, the pressures they were under, and how some of those pressures are much bigger than we realize for them. And in doing so, I hope it will explain to the general audience and the global audience how Americans need to make decisions to push certain priorities through and the trade-offs associated with that. That's really what we're trying to get at, is an explanation of the decisions. And if there's anything about the decisions that can be tweaked, our process, for example, how to manage the pressures, that's where the commission's work can be particularly useful. And then there's this other set of questions that have to do with how US policies influence how Americans are seen around the world. And let's just put it in the context of Muslim countries, because we're dealing with a war in Afghanistan, which is majority Muslim. Once US military operations in Iraq unfolded, once that war became what it became, once the Abu Ghraib scandal became public, and the Quran burning in Bagram airfield, there's lots of other examples, Blackwater contractors, hate crimes, et cetera, even in the United States, discrimination against Muslims. How does all of that coming together create a cultural zeitgeist, if you will, that influences how the US is seen in the world and in Afghanistan? Did it make it harder for us to do our work? If not, fine. If you can't measure it, fine. But we can get at the sentiment through subject matter interviews or talking with people, right? The interviews are going to be really useful here. Documents, less so. But we've been having on the commission some really powerful conversations about the connectivity of US involvement in Afghanistan to the outside world, because the last thing we want to do is write a story about ourselves for ourselves. That is a very boring story, and I don't want to read that, right? I know what happened there, but I don't know how our actions truly intersected and interfaced with all of your hopes and dreams and fears and anticipations. And I'm saying these are very kind of hopes, dreams, fears, anticipations. It can be very cliche, it can be very basic, but I do think that we're dealing with some raw, basic emotions here, because we wouldn't all be here today if we didn't feel those things still. And I think that's something we can all work with together. So I've said it over and over again, but I think it's worth repeating that the research we do should reveal new insights into why US leaders made the decisions they did, what alternative options were explored or dismissed, and then how the critical debates evolved. And here we want to go way beyond all of the books that we've all read, the journalistic accounts, the memoirs. It's just one little sliver of the story. Our work is to sift through the books and the memoirs and the documents and the interviews and figure out where are the gaps, and then go and find all of you that were there in the room or doing the work, and see if there are gaps that need to be filled and then communicated to policymakers and to the public. The hardest part of doing all this is not the investigatory part of it, the pickaxe work. It's actually figuring out how to translate all of that into insights or lessons to apply to future challenges or decision-making scenarios, whether in Afghanistan or elsewhere. And here, I also want to be very clear. We're not looking only at ways to do war better, to manage conflict better. We're looking for ways to be better decision makers. How do you weigh questions like ethics, or will this damage our reputation, or what will people think of us if we do things that are against our values, as Ambassador McKinley was saying? how do you create a model for incorporating that into a policymaking decision? And do our structures allow that? Again, what our Commissioner Chris Molina was talking about, the NSC structure, does it even allow for the free flow of ideas or debate like that? Should it? Should there be ways to protect dissent or opinion on direction of contentious policies in ways that don't exist right now? Commissions can ask those questions because commissions are independent. We're part of the legislative branch. We take that privilege very seriously. So in doing so, and thinking very critically and boldly about how to create lessons, we also want to create something that's accessible. So I want all of you in this room to be able to read this report and hand it to, say, your 8th grade niece, or a friend who, doesn't work in foreign policy or in politics, but is really interested as a citizen. This book should speak to many audiences, but it has to be grounded in indisputable evidence if that's the case. It cannot read like an op-ed. And I do think that this is why having a group of stakeholders, both inside and outside government, is really important in the process of our work, to red team our conversations, to red team our outputs, to keep us in check. Because like I said, we like to talk to ourselves. We like to write reports for ourselves. It makes us feel good. But when you're asked to root your analysis and opinions in indisputable evidence, that's much harder, but it becomes much more relevant and impactful. So again, we're trying to do the hardest thing we can possibly do in a very difficult environment, admittedly. And this is, again, where I get a lot of rolling of the eyes. But all of the staff and the commissioners, a part of the commission, they all signed on to this because they like to do hard things. And they're all pushing themselves. And it's hard to, it's easy to work in your bureaucracy and in your institution and talk like everybody at the State Department talks or everyone in the military talks, right? And this applies to any government. What's really hard is to sit with people from across different institutional cultures and find some kind of new collective voice. And that, I think, is what the success of this project will be. Okay, I want to end. I see my minder here. I'm just glad nobody fell asleep. They had their coffees. That's good. Okay, so I want to end with a small vignette, and I think everyone will relate to this. That, I mentioned that I talk about this project with my kids, and I mentioned this in our hearing, our first public hearing we did as a commission. I brought my daughter, who is 12 years old. My son is 9. He should not be invited to a hearing, and so he didn't come. But I hope that one day the two of them are in high school somewhere and they can see the report on the shelf, just like some of us found the 9/11 Commission report in college, for example. And as they read it, I want them to appreciate the personal and professional sacrifices we all made, Afghans and Americans alike, to serve and defend, and that we believed in hope for a little bit of time. And I think for more time to come. And I want them to understand Afghanistan and its people with a deep empathy and openness and gratitude, which I feel today in this audience. And then finally, they should appreciate the rigor and honesty with which we looked in the mirror and pushed ourselves to admit our mistakes and do better next time. And in that context, I'm not just talking about Americans, I'm talking about everyone that was involved in the war. But you have to speak for yourself. We are not going to speak for you. So we hope you will join us along, and thank you very much for this opportunity today. And thank you, Dr. Farhadi, for your support.